I was sentenced to 7 years in jail and had to pay a $400,000 fine. That's what this scandal cost me personally.
I was assured that there was nothing illegal in our cars.
Nobody back then was thinking fraud. It was a breach of the engineer's code.
When Winterkorn called me, I told him we'd been cheating and that the cars had test detection software. And Winterkorn must himself have been wondering how much he knew.
On September 18th, it was on the news. Whose idea was it? When and who covered it up? Who knew and at what point?
The diesel emissions scandal, known as Germany's largest industrial scandal, with victims running into the millions of customers. But who exactly was behind the fraud? VW's then CEO, Martin Winterkorn? His managers and engineers? Years later, they are now finally going on trial. This is the first time that some of those involved have talked to the media about culpability, innocence, and ignorance, and what happens when nobody is accountable. This is a long story with many chapters. At its center is a secret, a trade secret kept quiet for 10 long years, until the news broke in September 2015. The US Environmental Protection Agency served a notice of violation, alleging that VW had manipulated emissions test results.
This is a difficult, massive challenge for Volkswagen. I suspect they're in crisis mode.
Rund 11 Millionen Autos sollen mit der manipulierten VW-Software weltweit auf den Straßen unterwegs sein.
Wir sind dabei, die Hintergründe schonungslos aufzuklären. Dazu kommt in diesen Stunden alles auf den Tisch.
CEO Martin Winterkorn accepted responsibility for the scandal.
Ich entschuldige mich in aller Form bei unseren Kunden, mit den Behörden und der gesamten Öffentlichkeit für das Fehlverhalten.
An apology unable to save the job of Germany's best-paid executive.
Martin Winterkorn tritt als Vorstandschef von Volkswagen zurück.
Before events had even been properly investigated, the VW Supervisory Board absolved Winterkorn of any blame.
Wir wollen dabei ausdrücklich festhalten, dass Herr Winterkorn keine Kenntnis hatte von der Manipulation von Abgaswerten.
At the same time, VW was similarly swift to blame others, claiming that a small group of engineers was responsible.
Das rechtswidrige Verhalten von Entwicklern und Technikern in der Motorenentwicklung hat Volkswagen ebenso geschockt wie die Öffentlichkeit.
The management insisted they'd been completely in the dark. Who knew what, when, will now be told in court for the first time. Will those responsible continue to shift the blame to each other?
It's only human to try and delegate responsibility for criminal action, but you have to work with that and see what emerges in court, and whether the story is ultimately credible and believable or not.
Some claimed they'd issued repeated warnings, while others denied ever having heard about the scam. We gained access to internal documents and interviews, and were able to talk to some of the 100 or so people linked to the scandal. We then had 3 actors read what these individuals told us. One for executives, and 2 actors representing engineers. Our sources wish to remain anonymous, but at the same time tell us their stories.
My motivation is that after doing so much wrong in the past, at least for the people who ask themselves who these awful people are, I want to explain how astonishingly easy it is to get into something so bad.
Are we victims or perpetrators? Neither. I knew, but I didn't prevent it. And I'm still mad with myself, absolutely.
Darüber ärgere ich mich heute, keine Frage.
One of the people involved offered to talk to us on camera, Oliver Schmidt. He became the public face of the scandal. His US police mugshot went around the world.
Well, it's not often you see an auto executive arrested.
Breaking overnight, a major development in the Volkswagen emission scandal. The New York Times reports VW executive Oliver Schmidt was arrested this weekend.
A trip to the U.S. by Oliver Schmidt allowed FBI agents to intercept him Saturday at Miami Airport.
Ich hab's noch bis zur Toilette geschafft. Ich hab's auch noch geschafft.
I made it to the restroom. I was able to pull my pants up, and then 5 FBI agents and 3 airport police stormed the toilet. I was put in a cell, given prison clothing. I was booked at exactly 2 o'clock when the news was on. The story was my arrest, a big welcome to the cell block.
Oliver Schmidt pleaded guilty and spent 3 years in a prison in the US. In 2020, he was transferred to a prison in Germany. This is the first time he's talked on camera about his involvement in the emissions scandal. He had good connections with US environmental authorities. Being economical with the truth cost him everything.
Meine Schuld ist ganz einfach.
My crime was flying to the US and talking to bureaucrats. I spoke with them in a way I shouldn't have. I didn't tell them everything I knew.
Habe ich nicht alles gesagt, was ich wusste.
An omission that landed Schmidt in prison. But who else was accountable? In the end, everyone claims their innocence. Which is exactly how the story began years ago. VW executives wanted to expand in the US and devised a plan. They called it US 07 Clean Diesel. The executives wanted to take over the US market and eventually become the world's #1 car maker. This was in 2005. The car maker began working on a clean and economical diesel engine to win over new drivers in the US. Called the EA 189, it was designed to conform to the stricter pollution standards in the US while remaining relatively cheap. The engineering involved, however, was beset with problems from the outset.
Für den ersten US-Motor gab es schon viele Entwickler, die gesagt haben, mit diesem
Plenty of engineers said it would be too difficult to meet the US 07 standards with the first engine. They were ashamed, but didn't know how to make their project happen.
wissen nicht, wie wir das schaffen sollen.
But the pressure was on. The EA 189 was slated to be ready for mass production within 2 years, as opposed to the 4 or 5 normally.
Da gibt's dann eben besonders
Then there are the ones who like to upsell.
verkaufen.
I will manage it. I'm going to meet those standards with my fantastic engine.
Diesen Grenzwert zu erfüllen.
That was one of the key
Das ist
mistakes.
ja einer der zentralen Fehler, muss man so sagen.
The technical reality. The engineers were not even close to reaching their targets and the required emissions levels. There was growing consternation until one of the engineers told his colleagues about an interesting software that could detect when the cars were undergoing emissions tests. Test cycles are always based on 3 factors: acceleration, speed, and time. The software could detect the parameters and then reduce the nitrogen oxide output so that the cars passed US emissions standards during physical tests with inspectors. But back on the road, the cars emitted a much greater amount of nitrogen oxide. The engine's developers insist they never thought that would break laws.
Das war eine Testerkennung, das war ohne
It was test detection, no question. We wanted to detect when the car was on a test rig and when it wasn't. A lot of people found this test detection a tad unethical, but I didn't know whether it was illegal or not, because I hadn't read the emissions legislation either.
According to the engineers, every step and every decision was approved by the relevant superior, which gave the team a feeling of security.
In the spring of 2016, I still couldn't believe it. I always thought I hadn't done anything wrong, or I'd forwarded whatever I had done and found strange to the bosses. The result was a tendency to say, it's not that bad, everyone does it, and we'll just carry on.
But the story told by the executives who supposedly gave the go-ahead is a very different one.
The first I even heard of this issue was in 2015. If someone had told me 3 years earlier that we were cheating and breaking the law by using tricks, I would have taken them to task and demanded an explanation.
One person's word against another's. Did the engineers actually warn their bosses? And did those bosses really know nothing? This is where everyone gets to tell their side of the story. Braunschweig, the civic centre in the same German state as VW headquarters, has been repurposed as a courtroom. Prosecutors have been preparing their case for 6 years. The first trials are now underway. The defendants face charges including organised commercial fraud and tax evasion.
Wir gehen in der Anklage natürlich davon aus, dass die angeklagten Personen.
Our indictment assumes the defendants worked as an inner circle and knew everything, and that there was large-scale cheating from the outset designed to consolidate and expand VW's diesel car market shares.
Marktanteile erhalten und ausbauen sollte, was den Diesel angeht.
Among the first defendants, 2 high-ranking engineers identified under German confidentiality laws only as Hanno J. and Torsten D. They claim they repeatedly warned their superiors. Also in the dock, 2 former managers, Jens H. and Heinz-Jakob Neusser, who insist they had no knowledge of the manipulation.
Criminal activity over a 10-year period. We have a huge number of witnesses and other evidence. Altogether, it really is a trial of a different dimension.
Martin Winterkorn is the highest-profile defendant, but has for now been exempted from the hearings while recovering from hip surgery. With the supposedly small group of reckless engineers since mushrooming into an army of accused, Braunschweig can look forward to a long series of additional trials. In total, prosecutors have been investigating around 100 individuals.
Wie viele es wirklich waren, ich weiß es nicht, und das muss man jetzt rauskriegen. Und
I don't know how many it really was. And I wouldn't just look at Winterkorn. What did people the next level down know? Who issued the instructions? Who covered up? And who knew what and when? I have this file with about 50 witness statements covering all areas, from your regular engineer up to the departmental heads. Their statements were all about trying to save their own skin.
This is a tale with a variety of truths for every episode, including a meeting in November 2006 that's said to be the genesis of the emissions fraud. It was the first of 3 key situations in which VW staff had the choice of voicing in favour or against the deception. The engineers made a presentation for the then head of engine development, showing how the EA189 could pass the strict US emissions tests. The software developers provided a detailed description of the cheat feature, assuming their boss would then ban its deployment, they claim. One of them would later testify.
I was clear about our plan. I was expecting the boss to throw us out.
Except he didn't.
We need this function to assist the launch for the first 6 months, and we'll deinstall it as soon as possible. We'll carry on working to improve emissions. We'll get it done, and it'll be gone again inside 6 months.
The engine chief says today that his staff failed to make it clear that it was a cheat device and that he gave no approval for the test detection. After the meeting, one of those present sent an email to two colleagues.
What I understood was, if we are to use test detection, then in a way that we don't get caught.
The meeting is now considered the beginning of a gigantic fraud. At the time, it was perhaps seen as just a bit of industry-standard fiddling.
Das war eine Täuschung? Das hätte ich
Fraud?
so nicht im Kopf.
That's not what I had in mind. First, because it was standard practice to have functions like that. Second, because nitrogen oxide was not really an issue back then.
Da ist ja praktisch die
That was basically a green light. There was no real feeling of wrongdoing. It was seen more like jaywalking. A lot of people do it even if it's not allowed. And that was the sentiment.
They claimed they'd never seen it as fraud. We have a different opinion as our investigations progressed. Our findings, the results and the evidence that we've gathered tell a very different story.
The function, originally envisaged as a 6-month jump start, became a permanent fixture. Over 10 years, it was fitted in 11 million cars sold all over the world. January 2007, a few weeks after the engineers' meeting with the engine development head, Wolfgang Hatz, Martin Winterkorn was promoted to the position of CEO. Under his management, VW would enjoy record-breaking success. He had an engineering background himself and was known for his attention to detail.
Auch nur solche Beispiele, dass sich das Leder gleich anfühlt wie hier am Schalthebel, wo ich hinfasse, dass es alles dieselbe Lederqualität ist. Das sind so Feinheiten, auf die ich manchmal den Mitarbeiter auch hinweisen muss. Gebe ich gerne zu.
The VW diesel engine had yet to hit the market. Even with the cheat software on board, it was not ready for mass production, with progress impeded by clogged particulate filters and test car breakdowns. The new head of engine development needed a lot more money for the EA 189, which required the approval of Winterkorn.
Das war ein Desaster.
It was a disaster, plus the biggest development cost hike ever at VW.
At the end of 2007, the engine chief talked to Winterkorn, who had seemingly been previously unaware of the problems besetting the diesel engine project.
Das noch größere Fiasko, so habe ich Winterkorn das auch.
As I told Winterkorn, the bigger fiasco would have been seeing the cars break down en masse in the US due to faulty particulate filters. But simply protecting the filters via software could mean big trouble with the authorities.
Das habe ich ihm gesagt.
I told him, I remember very clearly. And he said to me, and?
Na und?
The engine chief insists he was talking about problems, but likewise knew nothing about any fraud. Winterkorn's memories of the conversation appear limited to the cost increase, with no recollection of any details. Not long after approving the multi-million euro project funding, he presented his company's showcase diesel engine.
We are challenging our competitors, and we plan to sell 800,000 Volkswagens a year in the US by the year 2018. The clean TDI in the Jetta is a strong sign of our commitment.
The clean diesel engine was finally launched in the US in 2008. One manipulated model was even crowned Green Car of the Year at the 2009 Los Angeles Auto Show. The engine was a resounding success, even if there were still serious problems. Car after car in the US ended up needing repairs because of the cheat software. On longer journeys, it assumed the car was on the test rig. The system switched to low emissions, but the filters became clogged. The engineer's solution? Optimize the software. Now it could even detect whether someone was at the wheel. We're now in the year 2012.
The next mistake was the decision to add the steering angle factor. And for me, that's also the tragic bit. A bit like the ghosts called by Goethe's Sorcerer's Apprentice. Of course it was bad, which is why the entire hierarchy was again urged to make that decision happen. But ultimately, the decision was taken.
Senior managers had again decided in favor of manipulating their diesel-powered cars. Again, a major strategic decision, and again, nobody challenged it. Meanwhile, the circle of those in the know continued to grow. This is Martin Winterkorn at the time. Did he know what was going on in his company? There's no documented evidence to the affirmative. The CEO was busy celebrating one triumph after the next, with VW increasing profit almost tenfold under his leadership. Martin Winterkorn was by now Germany's standout chief executive. He rubbed shoulders with world leaders, his annual salary 17 million euros. And VW was set for further success. But in 2014, developments took a new turn due to the work of another group of engineers. Researchers here at the University of West Virginia began using a different testing method. They measured emissions from cars while actually out on the road, instead of in the lab. And to their surprise, the VW engine's nitrogen oxide levels were up to 35 times higher than permitted.
We saw a vastly different performance between the test cell and the highway. Then we knew that the vehicle must be exhibiting some different behavior.
While scientists and inspectors were baffled, nobody yet was thinking fraud. They informed VW.
We fully anticipated that there would be a voluntary recall. Things had been fixed, and we heard nothing more about it.
The Virginia study was commissioned by the International Council on Clean Transportation, or ICCT. The developers at VW HQ in Wolfsburg knew it contained all the pieces of the puzzle to expose their machinations. An engineer remembers the increasing anxiety.
We knew we were busted. We had 500,000 vehicles in the US, and in the worst-case scenario, would have to buy them back.
The result was a growing tower of one lie after the next. Lies with a high price, as is now clear from internal VW reports.
Ich kann nicht beurteilen, wem die ICCT-Studie.
I'm unable to say who was aware of the ICCT study in full detail back then.
Aber sagen, dass
What I can say is that the main reason for the US authorities punishing us so harshly was us not telling the truth after that.
Nicht die Wahrheit gesagt haben.
May 2014, Martin Winterkorn is first told about the study. A close confidant, Bernd Gottweiss, wrote him a note that landed in the briefcase Winterkorn would take home every weekend.
Das ist die in den Medien ja auch schon bekannte.
That was the weekend mail, as reported in the media. It's an important point because it enables us to assert that from this moment on, Mr. Winterkorn knew that the vehicles in the US had a defeat device.
So named because it's designed to defeat tests. Bernd Gottweiss remembered the gist of the note.
I consulted Oliver Schmidt about the wording of the weekend mail. It even included defeat device. Everyone knew what we meant. I was assured that there was no logical explanation for the nitrogen oxide deviations. I knew we had to take action, not because we'd cheated, but because it was dangerous and our lack of an explanation.
Weil es brisant war und wir keine Erklärung hatten.
As this was in the weekend mail, I was preparing for feedback, but I didn't hear anything, not from Winterkorn either.
That reference was a red alert. While not actually referring to test detection, Gottweiss did warn Winterkorn that American inspectors could look for it. The exact wording:
"It's likely that the authorities will then search the VW systems for evidence of test detection being fitted in the engine control software. A defeat device."
But did Winterkorn even read that reference in his weekend mail? Did he understand what its contents might entail for the company? He would later effectively say that he hadn't read the alarming note. All he could remember was having been informed of the study. This same account Winterkorn would repeat later on the record at a parliamentary committee of inquiry in Berlin. According to his version of events, nobody mentioned manipulation or cheating.
What I wanted to know was whether it was a genuine problem. I was told, no, it's a technical issue. I cannot understand why I was not clearly informed earlier about the problems in the US. Of course, I asked myself too whether I missed or misinterpreted particular signals.
Only at the very end, he says, did he realize that the issue was an illegal defeat device.
Sein Auftritt vorm Untersuchungsausschuss, der hat mich ehrlich gesagt.
I found his appearance before the Committee of Inquiry frankly appalling. Martin Winterkorn presented himself as someone who understood the engineering and knew VW vehicles to a T. And there he is at the committee, pretending he'd never heard of emissions control systems.
Winterkorn says he was oblivious to anything untoward for almost 10 years. He knew nothing about the defeat device and nothing about the growing risks for VW. Is that plausible?
He was a stickler for detail. Although he was a boss for many decades. You're in charge of technical issues, but cannot have detailed comprehension of everything due to the sheer scale. You can't understand every single detail, no way.
He's a man with a wide range of different interests, and he had his people everywhere in the company, who I reckon also knew what was involved. Winterkorn is a very clever man in my eyes, and one interested in details. I really would be surprised if he hadn't noticed anything in all those 10 years.
Exactly what he did know back then remains unclear, but he evidently and massively underestimated the scope of the problems. Winterkorn's world revolves above all around the customer and their satisfaction, fuel economy, safety and driving enjoyment, all evidently more important than emissions.
The company's approach was quite clearly customer satisfaction has top priority. Customers being satisfied with their car was vital for Winterkorn, and the spirit of Winterkorn, as it were, was at the core of company culture. Emissions are not customer relevant, as long as the car isn't pumping out dirty, rancid fumes.
Volkswagen was not alone in its willingness to outsmart the inspectors. Once the VW emissions scandal hit the headlines, other car makers were also investigated, resulting in fines, claims for financial damages and recalls in Germany as well as the US. Among the new suspects, Mercedes-Benz, VW subsidiaries, Audi and Porsche, but also Chrysler Fiat and auto parts supplier Bosch.
Prior to 2015, there was legislation that was evidently not enforced. It had crass and obvious loopholes. And this legislation was simply not enforced, across the board. Volkswagen came clean. The others didn't. So this one-sided focus on Volkswagen isn't fair either.
VW
was the tip of the iceberg, but was the most brazen offender. But you need to remember that VW was far from the only company involved. As it turned out, it was not, as is often reported, a VW scandal. It was a scandal where the car industry in general used illegal methods to circumvent environmental regulations.
In 2017, Oliver Krischer was deputy chairman of the parliamentary inquiry into the emissions scandal. He says that Germany's road transport agency's checks were neither strict nor independent. The agency has rejected the claim as absurd, but Krischer insists he's right.
The
emissions scandal shows very clearly how the car industry is able to dictate stipulations, and that the point was not really monitoring vehicle emissions on the road. The focus was solely on ensuring that the official tests appeared to pass. It was designated quite blatantly as industry-oriented testing.
2015. Following the suspicious emissions readings in the ICCT study, the US authorities were unrelenting in their pursuit. Why are your diesels so dirty? How do you explain this? The VW engineers continued to equivocate while keeping quiet about the defeat device.
Our plan was to stall for time. When questioned, we were not to say a word about the technical background.
An internal email in March 2015 said words to the effect of,
VW is on thin ice in the US.
And further,
if I say what I know, there'll be red faces all round.
It was now obvious that the people, also in the US, had no idea what to do anymore and were at a complete loss. It was an awful atmosphere. We realized that they were sweating and were at their wits' end.
Eventually, VW faced an ultimatum from the US authorities. Either you provide an explanation or we won't certify your new cars. With disaster looming, VW held one crisis meeting after the next. Winterkorn himself faced damning testimony from his confidant Bernd Gottweis.
When Winterkorn called me, I told him that we'd been cheating, that the cars had a device that could differentiate between test bench and road.
Winterkorn would later challenge that account. While confirming the call had taken place, he denied he'd been given such a warning. Not long after that phone call, a third and crucial decision was made. On July 27, 2015, the VW headquarters in Wolfsburg was the scene of a product failure analysis meeting, at which Martin Winterkorn finally sat down with the engine designers for the first time. Reportedly on the agenda, what were they to do about the US diesel engines? What about the authorities? As for the rest of the meeting, one story with various narratives. Oliver Schmidt was among those present.
Das ist ja immer noch die Frage, was wurde an diesem Schadenstisch besprochen?
What was discussed at the meeting? Do you believe my version, where the board said we had to clarify this with authorities? Do you believe U.S. prosecutors, who claim VW management ordered a blanket smokescreen to the authorities? And the third version, related by executives to the parliamentary committee, that the board said nothing at all.
Evidently, there was a presentation which apparently referred to over 500,000 vehicles being affected on the American market, and the prospect of drastic penalties for VW.
Somebody apparently did a calculation and just multiplied the maximum penalty by the number of cars, written down on a slip of paper.
And that was discussed at the meeting?
Yeah.
Yes.
Winterkorn's account of events is a very different one. According to him, the meeting was not about an illegal defeat device or potential fines, or indeed whether they were to tell the truth to the authorities. Minutes from the meeting, however, revealed talk of only a partial disclosure of information. The VW inspectors did not subsequently claim that Winterkorn was lying, but they did accuse him of negligence and a failure to take action.
Dass eben nicht umfassend Hinweisen
They said he did not properly pursue illicit software functions in the 2-litre TDI after July the 25th, 2015, and that he failed to ensure that the inquiries from the American authorities were answered completely and truthfully.
bearbeitet und beantwortet wurden.
The man tasked with talking to the US authorities was Oliver Schmidt. His job to get VW out of trouble. At the same time, there may have been the prospect of using the opportunity to give his career a boost.
They chose me because of my contacts with the US authorities. There was a list of instructions, a script telling me what to say and what to omit. I was not to say the words defeat device, my undoing.
In August 2015, Schmidt flew to the US, where he told some of the truth, but not all. Regardless, the American investigators refused to relent. The show was over. A VW engineer was tired of lying and admitted to the scam. It was now a matter of not if, but when the disaster would happen, but VW executives were still confident that things wouldn't turn out so bad. Winterkorn would later say that the engineer's confession was likewise news to him. He made a high-profile appearance at Germany's biggest car show. It would be his last.
Sie kennen uns. Wir von Volkswagen lieben den sportlichen Wettkampf um die beste Lösung. Aber ich sage auch, Volkswagen bleibt im Driver's Seat.
2 days later, the American Environmental Agency went public with the scandal. The global headlines now made clear the gravity of the situation.
On September 18th, it was on the evening news. And that was when I knew, oh, this is bad.
Als ich zu Volkswagen gekommen bin,
when I arrived at Volkswagen, my impression was more that they had massively underestimated the consequences of what had been done.
von den Beteiligten massiv unterschätzt.
It's like being seriously drunk and doing 250 kilometers per hour on the highway and expecting to get a small fine, like for a parking ticket.
Hätten sie falsch geparkt.
Volkswagen is being told to recall nearly 500,000 vehicles over emissions software. They did what?
This is a difficult, massive challenge for Volkswagen. I suspect they're in crisis mode down in Wolfsburg.
Wir sind dabei, die Hintergründe schonungslos aufzuklären. Dazu kommt in diesen Stunden alles auf den Tisch. So schnell, gründlich und transparent wie möglich. Wir klären das auf.
Wer trägt da die größte Verantwortung?
Who has the biggest blame? The engineer who did the programming? Dunno. His superior? Who knew but didn't stop him? The bigger boss? Who knew but didn't do anything either?
Of course, a lot of them pledged ignorance and said, nah, I never heard about any acoustic function. It must have been hundreds of people, but then maybe 10?
Aber es wäre falsch, wenn wegen der schlimmen Fehler einiger weniger die harte und ehrliche Arbeit von 600.000 Menschen unter Generalverdacht gerät.
That was shocking. You're thinking, what are you talking about? And as an engineer, you think, the entire development of an engine plus X number of suppliers and what have you? If you add it all up and look at the total number of VW employees, is this just a handful of engineers? No.
VW insisted that 100 people constituted a tiny group compared to a workforce of 600,000, and that the company had taken appropriate action to resolve the affair.
Wir haben eine neue Diskussionskultur, eine neue Fehlerkultur.
We now have a different culture of openness and addressing mistakes. The diesel affair will always be part of Volkswagen's history, and there's no way around that. Like many of my colleagues, I've always acknowledged that this was the biggest case of corporate fraud in post-war German history.
In Deutschland nach dem Krieg war.
As 2021 dawned, VW was eager to put the scandal to bed. Before the trials got underway in Braunschweig, the company had already made its own verdict, dismissing engineers without notice, while others continue to work for the carmaker. VW said Martin Winterkorn was guilty only of negligence, and that after the crucial meeting should have been honest with the American authorities. But the carmaker did then sue him for damages. While Winterkorn's executive insurance covered the majority, he was left to pay 11.2 million euros out of his own pocket. A lot of money, but less than an average year's pay. Oliver Schmidt was among those who attended the emergency meeting. He was the man assigned to talking to the US authorities, but did not tell the whole truth, costing him 3 years in jail. He emerged a free man, but one who had since been sacked by VW.
For almost 20 years, my life revolved around the company and the factory. It feels weird coming back here.
Schmidt went to court to challenge his dismissal, but has yet to reach a settlement.
There's no progress now.
Why not?
No interest from the other party.
VW refuses to comment on individual cases. The Braunschweig prosecutors have charged 20-plus VW employees. A further 70 or so are still under investigation. The diesel emissions scandal is a story with no winners, where some have lost almost everything and others little.